What? I bloody know they're all geeks, but they're my geeks. What of it? But of course they're all bloody men. What woman in her right mind would watch this stuff? What? Fine, I'll have a look. Fuck me, Jenkins, what is this drivel? Hot tomato and what? I thought that was a soup. No? Get ready with me, eh? Well, I suppose it could work. Are you sure about this, Jenkins? All right, fine. Well, welcome to my bathroom. I'm just going to pop on a dressing gown here for a second. Right, there we are. Yes, I'll try and make it appealing to the non-blokes. Well, okay, so today we're going to talk about strategic bombing in my bathroom, apparently. Jenkins, are you quite sure this is a good idea? Fine. Strategic bombing, right. One of the most contested and difficult areas of World War II, which made 7.5 million Germans homeless, destroyed 1 in 5 residences in the entirety of the Third Reich, and killed or wounded over 1 million people. More than 1.3 million personnel were involved from the US and Duke forces, with 79,265 Americans and 79,281 Duke men killed or captured, and all of this just in Europe. What? Oh, for fuck's sake, fine. It may come as something of a shock to my audience that my rugged good looks aren't entirely all natural. No, of course, they come from a bottle, like all good things. Lots and lots of bottles. I use all of them, all at once, and then I wash it off before my hair turns blue and my teeth fall out. What? No, I do not have a favourite concealer. I don't like lawyers. Fuck me, can we get to the getting dressed bit of this? Look, being a fine figure of a man, I naturally like to wear red trousers, or if pushed... Look, I'm not, Jenkins, I'm just not doing this. What? What, really? Well, why didn't you say something like that before? Of course I'm going to do an advert for World of Warships. World of Warships is a massive online multiplayer game which you, yes you, can sample the delights of for free on your PC. World of Warships releases new content every single month. New ships, new nations, new ship classes, new paint jobs. They're at it all the time, unlike Her Ladyship and I, which is why I play it. Badly, but I do still play, so do feel free to come and find me and sink me. I mean, after all, almost everybody else has. It has truly outstanding graphics, with more than 40 different maps, a dynamic weather model, and new water effects and textures which really do make it look freaking awesome, even if you're a peasant playing it on a console. Did I mention you can play it on a console? Yes, you can. I mean, if you must, and you can probably sink me from one of those too, don't worry. Take a significant percentage of a nation's GDP and reduce it to a smouldering hulk in seconds, as God intended, playing as one of dozens of countries using hundreds of ships against thousands of opponents, or, if you're French, against the AI whilst you learnt the difference between being afloat and not being afloat. There may have only been one major dreadnought versus dreadnought engagement in World War I, but in World of Warships, you can do it all that way, all day, every day. Tell the boss to do one. You're an admiral now. Better yet, meet your fellow admirals and engage with them in one of the most vibrant and engaging user groups and forums, or indeed on their Discord channel, on the whole of the internet. Got good? Join a tournament. Suck like me? Watch people that got good doing a tournament. From October, all players will get access to the Captain's Club, where you, yes you, can get all manner of discounts and offers. Download World of Warships using the link below and feel good about yourself. Also, know that you're doing Jenkins a real solid, because ever since Her Ladyship decided to use the top-loading washing machine to wash her riding tack in, the poor thing has been broken, so Jenkins has been forced to wash my smalls by hand, a task that should soon be outsourced to the latest in high-tech gadgetry thanks to this advert. Help save Jenkins's gentle hands and fragile mind. Click the link below and use the offer code BRAVO, and you'll also get free stuff for free! Get 500 doubloons, 1.5 million credits, 7 days of premium account time, a free ship, and Jenkins's undying gratitude. And did I mention that the game is also free? No, well, it is. Unlike that bastard riding teacher Her Ladyship seems so keen on, World of Warships will not charge you a bean to play, although it might actually be equally dangerous to your long-term relationships, because it is damned addictive. Talking of which, that dirty little riding instructor, do remind me to put some more gunpowder in War Bastard's feed. That little cretin won't know what's hit him. Oh, where was I? Oh yes, World of Warships. It's jolly good fun. Okay, well, the good people of World of Warships are satisfied. Back to the subject at hand, namely strategic bombing. You would think that after all the effort and energy and destruction, the legacy of the bombing campaign from 1939 to 1945 would be bloody obvious. But the truth is, since the last bombs fell in Europe, there has really been nothing but a swirling mass of controversy and misunderstanding. So what I'm going to try and do in this series is look at the entire narrative history of the whole campaign. But we're going to have to break it up into manageable chunks. So what we're going to start with is the kind of pre-war thinking, some of the principles of strategic bombing that were being thought about, a rough narrative of how that began to fall out during the beginning of the war. And then next time when we come back again, we'll look at the US perspective, we'll look at the Butt Report, we'll show how badly things were going for Bomber Command when they first started the campaign. And then in further episodes, we'll really start to dive into how US and UK strategy unfolded in 1943 and 44, and then how the whole thing came to an end in 1945. Being bombed, for whatever reason, was not a lot of fun, and it happened to millions of people during the course of the war. It happened to my grandmother, who, in October of 1940, found herself taking a bath literally in the street, having been blown bodily through a third-storey brick wall. Had she been standing in her room, she would have been dead. Her role in the war effort? Well, she drove a truck for the ATS sometimes, but that really was it. She was, like so many millions of others, an innocent civilian going about her daily life with no ability to really impact the political situation in which she lived, much less bring the war to an end. One of the questions which we will try and examine during the course of this series, however subjectively, is whether or not the ends justified the means, not just from a material point of view, but also from a moral point of view. And we'll look at that question on and off as we go through, and also where people's thinking was at the time, because there were certainly questions as the campaign was unfolding, and indeed before it even started. One final note before we start. I'm going to refer to the United States Army Air Force and the United States Army Air Corps at different points during the course of this video. It's unbelievably confusing and people get it wrong on a regular basis. Up until June of 1941, it was the United States Army Air Corps, which continued to exist beyond that point, but was then only responsible for training. After June of 41, you talk about the United States Army Air Force doing the fighting bit. So when we talk about the 8th Air Force, that is an Army Air Force formation. I hope that clears that up. I know it does cause some issues for some folks. Having spent barely 35 years doing this flying malarkey, it is little wonder that the bright sparks in charge of strategic thinking on both sides of the Atlantic, and actually come to that in Paris, Rome and Berlin, hadn't necessarily grasped quite what this new shiny tool in their arsenal might be capable of when war broke out in 1939. During the First World War, the Germans had been the first to try and disrupt their enemy using Zeppelins to attack London. But by 1916, this campaign had come to a fiery end, with the Royal Flying Corps and the Royal Naval Air Service both figuring out that hydrogen plus incendiary rounds equals good times. The Germans tried again with their Gotha bombers, which looked wicked and carried just a handful of bombs, but unfortunately a lot of them got shot down or broke down en route. The British, in typical anything you can do, I can copy and improve style, developed the mental Handley Page V-1500 as a strategic night bomber capable of carrying 3,400 kilograms of bombs in an internal bomb bay and hitting Germany's industrial heartland in the Ruhr Valley. The first units arrived in France in September of 1918 and were ready for action by November, just in time for Germany to surrender. And honestly, on the British side, bomber development kind of stopped at that point for most of the interwar period. As a result, the impact, if any, of strategic bombing was still a complete unknown in 1939. Bombers are fucking expensive, and during the massive cutbacks of the immediate post-war period, they were an obvious target for expenditure control. On both sides of the Atlantic, Air Force leaders made increasingly bold claims about winning wars using bombs alone, but they had very little practical capability to back those claims up. Arthur Harris spent quality time gas bombing various northern tribes in Iraq and southern Syria, but that was about as far as it went, and then there were slow moves to go towards a monoplane design, but nothing particularly earth-shattering. The US Army Air Corps, meanwhile, developed so-called maritime patrol planes like the B-17, mostly to piss the Navy off, to be honest, and they practiced intercepting their fleet from time to time just to show them that it could be done. The assumption, certainly in pre-war RAF and to some extent, but less urgently in the US, was the bomber will always get through, which logically led to a mindset saying that an effective offence was much more important than an effective defence, because there could be no effective defence. You could send up some fighters, sure, but only if they could find the bombers, and the sky is fucking huge. You'll never find them. They'll basically be invisible, even during daylight, right? Oh, and the bastards might even come by night, and clearly no night fighter can ever exist, right? That this view was postulated by various military geniuses. Marshal of the Air, Hugh Montague Trenchard, 1st Viscount Trenchard, GCB, OM, GCVO, DSO, etc., and probably some bars, and founder of the RAF said so. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin said so. That weird Italian General Giulio Duet said so, and went further, claiming that if you did it right, you'd kill so many people that the enemy would be forced to surrender. Okay, well, you should probably know that Trenchard was quite convinced that his dead pilots from World War I were haunting him. Baldwin's primary claims to fame, including firing Winston Churchill and not being Neville Chamberlain, and Duet was dead by 1930, so really no one could ever prove him wrong or gainsay him. Nonetheless, the thought was out there, and in the groundwater, and everyone, from London to Berlin to Paris to Washington, believed it to a greater or lesser degree by the outbreak of war. Meanwhile, the bright young things in Fighter Command were busy making sure that these gentlemen would look fucking stupid in hindsight. Dowding was probably unaware of the old Polish saying, all mushrooms are edible, some of them just the once, but I think as he carefully crafted his Nazi emasculation mechanisms, he might have said, the bomber will always get through, but most of them only once. Indeed, the maddening thing about the pre-war thinking in the RAF is, had the air staff actually practiced putting bomber command and fighter command against one another, so many lessons could have been learnt, lessons which would later cost many thousands of young men their lives. Instead, fighter command and bomber command operated in glorious isolation of one another. By the eve of war, the broad strokes thinking in British High Command was that there would be an inevitable pattern to the way things would unfold in the event of a German offensive. The Nazis had an estimated 1,700 bombers to the RAF's 500. That attack had to be defeated, and that meant a fighter command. Okay, tick, Dowding has got that one. And then, so the thinking went, as the German bombers slowly got whittled down, the RAF could launch its attacks on Germany, which would somehow defeat the German air defences, and thus it would become a simple matter of bombing Germany until they surrendered. Easy. Okay. So we've considered some of the pre-war thinking there, but I reckon you could probably boil down most of the discussions that we'll have in this video, and indeed all discussions around aerial campaigns, into a few key principles that I like to think of as turn on, tune in, drop bombs, or if you prefer, the Hardthrasher methodology for winning a global air war. Number 1. You must be able to fly. Okay, even British manufacturers of the 1930s basically had this bit covered most of the time. But actually, there is a little bit more to this, because you need to be able to fly in machines that are capable of delivering a heavy enough blow to the enemy that you're going to make a real difference, to make the trip worthwhile. You're going to need to do it as high a speed as you humanly can using piston engine aircraft, and you need to be able to deliver the bombs from an altitude that meant that ground fire wasn't going to reduce your bomber to matchsticks. One other point, you're going to need some kind of long-range fighter. Whilst this last could be argued to be hindsight, actually if you stopped and looked in 1940 at the loss rates, you should immediately have concluded the same thing. That neither the RAF nor the US Army Air Corps did so until thousands of young men were dead is one of the great travesties of the Second World War. Number 2. How, pray tell, are you actually going to go about finding these targets? Well, the answer the RAF came up with in the 1930s, and actually really held on to until 1941, was no more complicated than look out of the bloody window. There was no official rank of navigator until 1940, and in 1939 of the 1,800 or so trained bomber pilots, fewer than 60 had gone on any kind of a navigation course. This issue would plague Bomber Command through the first 3 years of war, and it really wasn't until 1943 that they came up with any decent answers. The US Army Air Corps hadn't completely addressed this problem, although they had got planes for maritime patrol which required a bomber force that was ostensibly designed and capable of navigating over long distances. The reality was there were fantastically few pilots that could do it. They would in time adopt the box formation with a master bomber that led the way, but formations were still regularly getting lost well into 1944. Number 3. You must be able to hit the target. Hitting targets was one of the most vexing questions of the whole air war. Initially, the American approach was to spend a gargantuan amount of money developing a bomb sight known as the Norden after its inventor, which we will look at in the future. For the first part of the war, the British approach, by contrast, was to simply plaster the area with a lot of bombs. Neither worked very well. For instance, at the height of the 8th Air Force's campaign in Europe in 1944, it was necessary to send 108 B-17s, dropping 648 bombs to ensure that you had a 96% chance of getting 2 of those bombs onto a target about 500 foot by 500 foot. The RAF spent a huge amount of time innovating with various devices and developing their own bomb sight once it became apparent that they couldn't hit fuck all. But even by 1943, at the height of their bombing campaign, 10% of all bombs still landed outside of 3 miles from the target. And throughout this story, we'll keep coming to the question, assuming you can find it, how do you hit it? Alright, so far so simple. But as every commanding officer knows, sadly the enemy gets to have a say in your plan, which leads us neatly to point 4. You must have air superiority. Now this sounds simple enough. Everyone knows what that means, right? Having control of the skies. Well, yep, sure, but actually there are a few ways that you could define this. It could be very local air superiority, where for a short period of time you can remove the enemy from your bit of the sky. This is basically why the B-17, B-24 and later B-29s carried so many guns. The idea being that the enemy comes in and you simply shoot them down. Ergo, you've got local air superiority. You could also achieve a degree of tactical air superiority, which you might think of as being a little bit broader than your immediate pocket, perhaps by dominating a specific bit of sky for a limited period of time. If you widened the net a little bit further from just your bomber formation to, say, a whole sector or a whole country, and you sustain it indefinitely, well, then you have strategic air superiority. And then you can take things on a stage from there where there simply aren't any enemies to attack you, and what you've achieved at that point is air supremacy. Congratulations, you can now bomb whatever the fuck you want, assuming that you can find it, of course. And actually, at that point, whether or not you hit or miss it really doesn't matter so much, because all it's costing you is an extra load of fuel, a few more bombs, and, well, I guess the guys on the ground aren't going to be too happy about getting hit again, but you don't need to worry so much. You can go back again and again to the same target if you need to. On the other hand, if you don't have air superiority, and if you have no realistic hope of achieving it, then you have to look at secret option 4A, beloved of the RAF in 1940 and the B-2 stealth bomber today. You have to evade the enemy and not bother to try even getting air superiority in the first place. In 1941, this was done by choosing to fly at night when the enemies can't see you, except perhaps by using radar. The question of local, tactical, strategic, and air supremacy would likewise dominate the bombing campaign, basically for the rest of the war, and the answers to the problems that it posed were never good ones until the first half of 1944. And actually, by night, it actually got worse and worse and worse until the end of 1944, and we'll discuss both of those in future episodes. And this shouldn't have come as a complete shock. People had pointed out in the mid-1930s that defeating the enemy's air force might prove to be quite difficult. You're going to go and try and send slow-moving bombers against fast-moving fighters at ranges that are far beyond your own fighter's operational envelopes, whilst every AA gun the enemy can muster tries to kill you. And even assuming that you can somehow survive all of that, as was assumed by Trenchard and Douay and Baldwin and co., what if, for example, the Germans were unsporting and built more fighters faster than you could bomb their manufacturing capability? As we've discussed, the RAF at the time responded by saying, well, you don't have to do all of that, you can just bomb by night as God intended. So planning began much too late, actually, in 1939, for the RAF to be ready at some point in 1942. Only war broke out earlier than was expected and threw the first of many spanners into the works. On the other side of the Atlantic, the US AAC said, well, fuck it, we'll just add more guns and we'll have to blast our way in and blast our way out, even though that approach meant carrying just a fraction of the payload and making each plane fantastically expensive in men, material and treasure. The German approach, by contrast, was to totally ignore all of these problems and simply only really build flying artillery which would be protected by its own air umbrella at short ranges. Alright, so we've got off the ground with a decent load, we've got a decent speed up, we've navigated our way to our target, we have a means of hitting our target, we've kicked the shit out of anybody who's tried to stop us. That just leaves one last problem. You must know what to hit and why to hit it. This last point is probably the most critical. It dictates a bunch of other decisions that you're going to have to make, from the planes that you choose to build, to the tactics that you deploy, to the targets that you're going to go and hit. In the US, as we've touched on a couple of times, there was a feeling that you could, if you really thought about it, identify a bunch of critical targets which, if you destroyed them, would bring whole nations to their knees. Blow up a power plant here, or a ball bearing factory there, an aqueduct over there, and before you know it, the population will be out of heat, light and transport and starving to death, so they'll beg for surrender from their government, right? This was all pretty hypothetical stuff, to be honest with you, until December of 1941 and the US entry into the war. So for now, we're going to leave the US and focus on the RAF, who had a more practical problem more immediately. Whilst the RAF didn't share the optimism of some of the US staff officers about hitting stuff with like 4 bombs or whatever and knocking Germany out of the war near instantly, it did recognise that the Ruhr had something like 51% of all industrial workers there, producing 70% of all Germany's equipment, and it was well in range of pre-war British bombers. In 1937, a chap who rejoiced in the resplendent name of Sir Edgard Ludlow Hewitt became C-in-C of Bomber Command. Ludlow Hewitt had started flying in 1912, and in 1914 he joined the Royal Flying Corps as a pilot officer. Through courage and skill, he's promoted steadily to command first No. 1 Squadron and then a whole wing, and he finished the war, somewhat improbably, as a brigadier general. Post-war, he served in Iraq and in India before moving into various staff posts in London. He had 2 primary strengths. He was a huge advocate of aircrew training, and he knew how to fly fighters. Quite what on earth he was doing in the job of Bomber Command completely eludes me, as it appears that he knew fuck all about bombers, but I guess someone had to do the job and perhaps no one else wanted it. In fairness, he did stop and he spent some time learning about how to use them, or learning how to use them in theory anyway, and together with some bright sparks at the Air Ministry, he did come up with a plan. Much like the USAAC at the time, they determined that to knock Germany out of a future war, all they needed to do was to fly 3,000 sorties, hit 156 oil sites and 26 coking sites. No, you dirty little bastards. Look, a coking site is not anything to do with modern Germany's gay bars, nor indeed a well-known company from Atlanta, nor indeed a seedy 1980s stockbroker. It's coal, right? It's coal that's been heated in an oxygen-free atmosphere to effectively, I guess, kind of distill it, remove impurities, and therefore it burns a lot hotter, so you can use it to smelt metal. Oh, where was I? Yes. The plan said that he could do this during daylight and lose only 176 bombers, and the war would be, in the RAF High Command's opinion, over. I don't wish to foreshadow too much, but you will note that this is a video called Part 1, which should perhaps give you a clue as to how well this was going to go for Ludlow Hewitt and his bomber command. The previous plan, War Plan 5, had basically said bomb the Ruhr, and this more subtle plan was therefore labelled War Plan 5A. Everyone slapped one another on the back, proclaimed a job well done in early 1938, just as the Munich crisis broke out. At which point some bright spark looked at the whole thing and went, what if we just bombed the oil? You see, Germany relied on imported oil. Indeed, it would continue to rely on imported oil and synthetic production for the entirety of the war. The boffins in the Air Ministry figured that if this capacity was knocked out, Germany would be out of the war much faster. And so, later in 1938, with German forces marching through the Sudetenland, War Plan W6 was put together just to hit the oil production sites. And they put a bow on it, popped it in a drawer, and considered the job done. But then some other clever young thing pointed out that perhaps one needed to hit the transportation network in Germany instead, and this was bound to stop the Germans from moving shit around. That would give the boys in the army a chance of doing their job on the ground, and actually if you concentrated on, surprise, surprise, the Ruhr again, you could theoretically stop anything from being moved in or out of Germany's industrial heartland, and thus bring the whole of Germany to its knees, without having to touch anything else. Enter then, stage left, in early 1939, War Plan 5B. And just as the air staff might have turned their attention to more important matters, like, for example, trying to find the fucking targets in the first place, the French suddenly popped up, because from the beginning of 1939, there was an incredible imperative to try and work together. And they said words to the effect of, "Stand back, mes amis, we will do the hard work, all you need to do is bomb les Boches as they form up," which actually seemed to have some merit to it, but for which RAF Bomber Command was woefully ill-prepared, having only the Ferry Battle, which everyone knew had the survival skills of a lemming on a cliff top. And by this point, things were getting a little bit real in Poland, so no new war plan with the French was drawn up, but equally, none of the other plans were fully adopted either. I relate all this by way of saying the what bit of our last question was actually a lot harder than it might appear to be, and indeed the why bit is really open to question, with ideas ranging from it'll win the war through to it's a compliment that's useful for other forces, with the former being cited by the moment anybody mentioned something like budgets and the latter being considered more realistic behind closed doors. None of these questions were really resolved pre-war by either the RAF or the USAAC, and a lot of the questions were still open to interpretation, really as late as April 1944 in the run-up to Overlord and the invasion of Europe. And on top of all of that, there was one further very minor problem to overcome. Most people thought that bombing was literally the worst, and whilst they weren't exactly rules of air warfare in international law, countries headed by the United States were trying to declare that bombing must never happen if there was a chance that civilians could get hurt. In late 1930, this led the US further down the road of trying to develop the super-duper bomb sights, and in 1939 caused the UK General Staff to suddenly stiffen and nudge and wink at one another underneath the table, because what they realised was that they had a force which was 1/3 the size of Germany's, and if they could garner both international sympathy and time to build the bomber force up by not killing civilians, they might just be back in the game. Hence the comment, which I'm sure you're familiar with, which was along the lines of you can't possibly bomb Germany because you might destroy private property. That wasn't the point. The point was to try and garner international sympathy. And thus, War Plan 7, also known as Plan K, was born, which was to not go after industry, nor oil, nor trains, nor troops, nor transport, but just the German fleet, which the Admiralty thought was a bloody brilliant idea, but it was really a tacit acceptance by the air staff that they were coming to the terrifying conclusion that they might have a very expensive bomber force they couldn't actually do anything with. I'm jumping ahead a bit here, but when Arthur Harris took over as CNC in 1942, he got a lot of stick for just focusing on area bombing and labelling everything else as a panacea target. That's to say, he labelled everything else as targets which would make you feel better for bombing them, but wouldn't actually do a lot in the long term. You can perhaps understand his try and focus on the military maxim, focus on the objective, or as Jenkins might put it, kill the target until it is dead, sir, when you consider that there were 7 war plans developed within 3 years, each with their own set of advocates within the Air Ministry, and things weren't a lot better on the US side of things, both before they entered the war and after. Harris certainly fucked up by not being more flexible, but one perhaps can sympathise with that position, to trying to stick to one thing until it was done. All of this should be set against the backdrop of pre-war European thinking that we kind of explored a little bit before. The bomber will always get through and all that. Building on this general level of hand-wringing and panic was the 1936 Joint War Planning Committee report on the morale effect of area bombing. Accepting at face value the assertion that the bomber would always get through, the JWPC proceeded to go off the very deepest of deep ends. It claimed 30% of London Port Authority's capacity would be knocked out within 24 hours of a German bombing campaign starting. London would suffer 20,000 dead in that same period, and 150,000 dead within a week. Gas would cause mass carnage. Britain would be on her knees within a month. On the one hand, such dire predictions were clearly awful, but on the other hand, both Fighter Command and Bomber Command could, and indeed did, take a great deal of this report and use it to justify massive increases in spending on their respective forces. Moreover, the idea that bombing might deliver a catastrophic blow to a nation's morale sank into the bedrock of strategic thinking in political and military circles at all levels on both sides of the Atlantic. It was this thinking which launched the RAF down the idea of area bombing in 1942, and the US later in the war to firebomb Tokyo. Indeed, it was a continuation of this thought which really inspired the entirety of the Cold War and the build-up of nuclear weapons, but that is perhaps a stretch too far for today. Let us then return to the immediate pre-war era, where we find in the summer of 1939, just as Herr Hitler's armies prepared to attack Poland, the RAF had a fundamentally conflicted and confused set of pressures and ideas. The reality was that this confliction of what to hit, why to hit it, and the mechanics of how to hit it were in a constant state of flux, both within the UK and the US high commands, really throughout the war. Most of the discussions that we will have from this point on relate back to these 5 key points, one way or another. I probably can't put this off any longer. I'm going to have to talk about what the RAF was flying in Bomber Command in the interwar era, and I don't really want to. The problem was that these planes were pretty much universally bloody awful, and as with so much of the RAF's procurement strategy in the interwar years, even thinking about it makes me want to curl up in a ball and cry. Also, the planes I'm going to talk about are not going to be around for that long, so whilst I may well come back and do a deep dive into them on individual videos in the future, for now all I really need you to know is the names of the types and roughly how they conspired to kill their crews, if not a lot of anybody else. God, fine, alright, look, we'll start with the ferry battle. They made 2,000 of these bloody things before they realised what a shit idea it was. It was a bomber that couldn't carry many bombs. Its primary benefit was it was really, really cheap, and later in the war it would be adapted as a trainer because it flew pretty well, but I mean, that's kind of it. They reported into Bomber Command, but they were really tactical aircraft, and honestly, no one knew quite what to do with a bomber that couldn't bomb much and would die instantly upon reaching the front. If you want to know more about this abysmal waste of money and effort, go and check out Rex's Hangar's Deep Dive. It's an excellent video, but I can't bring myself to do it here. And then we have the Bristol Blenheim, which at least did have some range, and it also had a degree of survivability, sort of akin, I suppose, to a moth around a candle. Well, that's still better than a battle. They were mainly used for zooming around France after being withdrawn for being too slow and too vulnerable. They were later developed into the fantastic ground attack aircraft, the Bristol Beaufighter, but in their 1939 form they were ridiculously vulnerable, sporting a single top-mounted turret with only 2 303 machine guns and truly crappy fields of fire. And then we get into the medium bombers, such as they were. The Armstrong Whitworth Whitley. Looks pretty cool, right? And it could lift a reasonable weight of bombs for 1937, about 8,000 pounds, which is roughly the same as a B-17. But unlike the 17, it only had 2 machine gun turrets, one front, one rear, which meant any beam attack at all from absolutely anything would kill it dead. And it flew far too low and far too slowly, and was incredibly fragile. They were eventually adapted into tug aircraft for towing gliders, and good riddance to them. And then you have the death trap that was the Hadley Page Hampton, which, unlike what I said in my B-17 video, you can actually close the cockpit on. But really, you wouldn't want to. You'd want to leave it open so you could get out as fast as possible when it inevitably caught fire, because these things were completely lethal to their crews and no one else. The idea was similar to the Do-17 for the Luftwaffe, to build a medium bomber capable of sustained high speeds. They could go pretty quick for a 1936 design. They could cruise fully laden at 206 miles an hour. That's about 26 miles an hour, faster than a fully loaded B-17, by the way, but they're only carrying 4,000 pounds of bombs. That's actually more than the B-17 would carry on operation, but that's by the by. It was still a lot slower than every aircraft in Luftwaffe service in 1939, and note, if you will, the single rear-facing machine gun and a single forward-facing 303. Dear God, what were we thinking? Last on this roll of cost over quality decisions is the Wellington, which, well, alright, the Wellington wasn't awful. It was pretty rugged, it was pretty quick, it carried a respectable 4,500 pounds of bombs, it had waist gunners as well as guns fore and aft, and it was a pretty adaptable platform. Nearly 12,000 of these things were built during the course of the war, and it wasn't actually retired from service until 1953, making it comfortably the longest serving bomber of World War II. Alright, we've done the bombers, let's put them to one side, we can forget about them for the moment, we'll come back to them in a minute. Let's talk about something happy, like the outbreak of war. In September 1939, suddenly all the great plans that the British had laid down so confidently were brought in from the realm of theory to stark reality, which came as something of a nasty shock to many of the higher-ups in Bomber Command. Ludlow Hewitt, still erstwhile CNC of Bomber Command, suddenly faced the possibility of having to put War Plan 5A, that's the Ruhr Plan, into action and commit his entire force to daylight strike to knock out Germany. Having had no doubt a few stiff brandies, he came to realise that Germany was, big. Biggily big, super big, and it began to dawn on him, and indeed many of the air staff, that they had a major problem in the form of the Luftwaffe. If you want to bomb a steelworks or a petrol plant or a coal mine, then the RAF of 1939 would need to flow low in daylight, and this was going to be proved nothing short of suicidal. As an example, in early 1939, a force of 8 Blenheims had gone in low to attack targets in the Ruhr and had been torn apart by the AA guns, losing all 8 aircraft. And in December 1939, 2 raids by Wellington suffered more than 60% casualties flying in daylight at moderate height. Ludlow Hewitt realised that at medium altitudes he could kiss goodbye at least 50% of his bomber force, which would permanently cripple Bomber Command. To quote brave Sir Robin, sometimes it is better to bravely run away. Plan W6 and W4A looked like much better bets. Go after the oil plants bit by bit and do it by night, and don't risk the force and, feel like you're contributing without having to do a whole lot or actually prove that you've hit anything. This change of heart from the man who'd been responsible for pre-war Bomber Command was seen as a serious failure. Because it was, and thus Ludlow Hewitt was rapidly replaced by Sir Charles Portal in April of 1940, and Bomber Command made the crucial decision to switch to night bombing and attempt to attack Germany's oil infrastructure. Ludlow Hewitt would go on to oversee bomber training for the rest of the war, a job he was genuinely good at, and he would redeem himself somewhat by focusing on navigation, more of which in a bit. Meanwhile, the French were actually mightily relieved. The RAF bombing campaign of German cities might have made Les Boches angry, whereas bombing of German army formations might have made the RAF look good, neither of which was a great outcome from the French High Command's perspective. I mean, Christ, they might have had to go on the offensive or something. It was bad enough that the British Army wanted to hightail it into Belgium. No, mes amis, far better to sit behind these nice static positions with these nice clear fields of fire and have another jetain and think about the world. Who knew, maybe Les Boches wouldn't come after all. Of course, on the 10th of May 1940, Les Boches came in a very, very hard way, and the whole thing went to shite. By the 17th of June, France had fallen. In the blink of an eye, the entire strategic position had changed, and as this happened, Bomber Command made a very important discovery. The night time is dark. Like, crazy dark. Like, you can't see shit, fam. On the 9 or 10 nights a month when there might have theoretically been enough moonlight to hit targets, there was cloud cover, which meant they couldn't hit the targets. And since no one could navigate for toffee in daylight, they certainly couldn't navigate at night time. It turned out that what they could hit was the invasion barges, and the Dortmund-Ernst Canal, and occasionally a Luftwaffe airfield or two. But these things came at huge cost during daylight, or with wild inaccuracy at night. They went about this business with gusto, smashing stuff up across northern France as best they could and beating up into bits of Germany, especially if they thought that it looked important. But not really doing much, and the whole oil plan never really came off. All this was excellent, if costly stuff, with much dash and daring do, but it wasn't really doing much strategically to move the dial, and various folks within the RAF were beginning to suspect that there was a serious problem. Attrition rates in the squadrons at this point in the war were absolutely horrific, with some units being wiped out in single actions. And then a weird thing happened in mid-August 1940. Some Hamptons, who'd got quite lost, managed to bomb a bit of Berlin, pretty much by accident. And having got a reaction out of a pissed-off Hitler, and following a Luftwaffe accidental raid on London, they then doubled down and launched a deliberate raid against Berlin's Tempelhof airport and a couple of aircraft manufacturing plants on the outskirts. 67 Wellingtons and Hamptons attacked on the night of the 25th, 26th of August 1940. Attacked. They missed, obviously. Berlin was covered in cloud, and actually only 29 bombers managed to drop anything anywhere near it. But it sent Hitler batshit crazy. So they thought, fuck it, let's do it again. And they did. And again. And again. In all, more than 300 sorties were flown over 10 days against Berlin, resulting in Hitler losing his goddamn mind and ordering Goering to attack London on the 4th of September, thus altering the course of the Battle of Britain. Although I will note, for those of you that may not have seen my Battle of Britain series, just be aware, it altered it, but perhaps not the way that you think. Reports on the damage were breathlessly recited by bits of the British press, and then a Belgrade diplomat popped up in London saying that the people of Berlin were at the point of morale collapse. Of course, they weren't. After the initial shock had died down, people just got on with their lives, which is what they did after pretty much every raid throughout the whole of the Second World War in pretty much every built-up area, with the possible exception of Rotterdam. Unfortunately, the air staff leapt on these reports, but perhaps understandably so. The problem was that they couldn't really show, despite the missions, despite the losses, despite the effort, despite the energy, what their attacks on industry were doing, the material damage. And this was partly because they hadn't really got proper bombing cameras yet. They were supposed to have 168 to fly with, but in fact they only had 12, and none of them were working at night as intended. It was still a very early stage of development. So the air ministry couldn't really show what it was or what it wasn't hitting with any material objective proof. So when an apparently reputable source popped up and appeared to be supporting ideas like the bomber will always get through, and the sort of slightly nutty results that the Joint War Planning Committee had predicted back in 1936, one perhaps can forgive the air staff for being ecstatic and starting to consider whether or not morale bombing over material bombing was a better idea. A quick word on accuracy at this point during the course of the war, because it's kind of relevant, and I know we've touched on it briefly before, but in 1938 it had been established through a complex and arcane set of calculations that I call blind guesswork, that during daylight hours bombers would be able to get their bombs within 300 yards of a target pretty consistently, and this was used as a base unit of measurement. Unfortunately, it hadn't really been tested very hard. There was no long-range bombing mission over unfamiliar territory during peacetime from high altitude to test what would happen, partly because the navigation that would have been involved was simply beyond most people that were in the RAF, and they kind of didn't want to talk about it much. There was a real problem here because the accuracy for night bombing, though, was a complete unknown in its entirety. There'd never been any testing of any kind, and this was mostly for safety reasons. Bombers were not allowed to drop bombs at night on the British mainland. Given what we know now, that's probably just as well for all concerned. There's a non-zero chance that they would have hit Manchester or leveled Glasgow and claimed success or something. Due to this dearth of data, someone, and it isn't at all clear to me who, decided to simply say, look, if it's 300 yards by day, it must be about the same by night. Children, it is not the same, not even close to being the same. This 300-yard figure was utterly crucial because it was used for all subsequent calculations about the numbers of aircraft and weight of bombs that they needed to get on targets throughout 1939 to 1942. And this massively overestimated the damage that they were doing, especially to the oil production facilities of Nazi Germany. As I mentioned a minute ago, some within the RAF were in fact growing suspicious that they weren't hitting a lot. The road to realising just how badly things were going actually started on the 24th of December 1940, when finally some, quote, excellent photographs of the Scholven and then the Gerkenskirchen oil production plants were taken. These were the first proper post-strike photographs of bomb damage done during the course of the war by what would later become the Photographic Reconnaissance Unit, or the PRU. These two plants had been heavily targeted with over 20 sorties and reportedly very good hits. The photographs actually showed no damage whatsoever. None. Nada. Nil. Not a single bomb crater even. Initially, various members of the air staff tried to pass this off as not the right plants or to question when the photographs had been taken, but the fundamental point was that the evidence was irrefutable. They had a massive fucking problem. Before an earthquake happens, tectonic plates rub and grind against one another with increasing pressure before finally a sudden and dramatic shift happens and Los Angeles disappears into the Pacific or whatever. The S&G photographs were the first shift in those tectonic plates inside the RAF that would lead to Arthur Harris and the area bombing of 1943. It was clear that Bomber Command could not hit a barn door from 10 paces. The first impact was to end the oil plan. In fact, it was the end of bombing in Germany full stop. The entire weight of Bomber Command was shifted to the Atlantic in February 1941 on the orders of Churchill, and it wasn't until the 9th of July that the second bomber offensive in Germany began, which is where we will pick things up next time. I'm going to leave things there for now, as we've seen how pre-war planning had bled into real-world experience, how woefully prepared Bomber Command was for actual strategic bombing, as well as how they simply couldn't cope with the German defences during daylight. We've also seen how they started to realise that they weren't really hitting anything, and before my American cousins laugh too hard, they should be mindful that their turn is coming shortly. When we come back next time, we will have a look at the much-vaunted Butt Report, the official document which laid bare just how badly things were going for Bomber Command, and some of the plans that were then put into place which led to the killing of tens of thousands of civilians, but an incredibly improvement in accuracy. We'll also see the formation of the 8th Air Force and its almost immediate collapse, and what combined operations actually meant in 1942-43. Well, I hope you enjoyed this, and if you did, please do note that I have a Patreon, where for a mere pittance you can join my legion of nerds on my private Discord, and a huge thank you to the crew of you that have already signed up. If you'd just like to write me a wall of text, please do feel free to send me an email to lordhardthrasher@gmail.com, or feel free to drop a comment in the text below, but please do keep things respectful. As ever, I would be eternally grateful if you could choose to subscribe and click the old button below. It does help with the old algorithm. Thank you. Until next time then, ladies, gents, and everything in between, I wish you peace, love, and jelly babies.